Prey by Arcane Studios is a stealth-based FPS. Now, this isn't a new IP, it's been used before, I believe in about 2006, but as far as I know, they have nothing to do with each other, so for the purpose of the review, I'm pretty much just going to be calling it Prey rather than Prey 2017. For the sake of cogency and cohesion in this video, I'm going to be dividing it into three sections: story, combat, and exploration. Now, there's a single theme that connects the entirety of the game, especially the three sections of this video, and that being gameplay choice, because this game is almost built on the back of the idea of giving the player choice in everything that they do, as I'll explain. First of all, a judgment on the story. The beginning of the game was really interesting, especially during the tutorial and the opening. It was just this really intriguing way to open the game. It throws you into this mysterious world where you play a character who seems pivotal but also a test subject, and everything is just kind of not right, and it very much fits into the overall theme of the game, but the story kind of loses me really quickly. It feels a lot more like it's a gameplay based game rather than a story game, because the story is a bit weaker, and that's completely fine for me at least. It does feel sad though, because it kind of starts off being really interesting and something new and intriguing, but then it quickly becomes just sort of a bland, insipid Alien Menace style game. Regardless, the tutorial, and especially the story in the tutorial, was done really well. It taught you the mechanics of the game, and my favourite way, honestly, that tutorials can do this, by piquing your interest and giving you something interesting to do whilst keeping you in this world and keeping you immersed, rather than just sort of pushing you along in the classic way that tutorials do, like obviously learning the mechanics. This makes you do it and want to do it, and it gives you interesting questions and things to do during the tutorial whilst hinting at the story and giving you interesting visuals, introducing you to the themes. It kind of reminded me of my favourite tutorial, Fallout 3, in terms of how much I enjoyed it and how good I felt it was at introducing me to the mechanics and the story. I'm only really going to give a quick synopsis of the story because I feel like it's one of the weakest parts of the game, so that's all I can say about it. It's just kind of, it starts strong and ends weak, and it feels a little cliche in parts, but it works well enough to deliver the good gameplay that it does. So a synopsis of the story would be that you're Morgan Yu. You get to choose whether you're a woman or a man, and you're the co-founder of a company that runs the Talos 1 space station that orbits the Earth, and it gets overrun by an alien menace, the Typhon, and your brother's involved with it somehow, and there are elements of intrigue and mystery and choice throughout the game, but that mostly comes down to gameplay rather than the actual story. I did think the game ended particularly weak. It gives you, or it presents all of your choices that you've made throughout the game, adding some gravity to the story and the side quests, because a lot of these choices are made through the side quests. But then it gives you a final choice, which I'm not sure why really. It felt like very ham-fisted, very cliche, similar to Far Cry 3 style of ending the game with a final choice that, if you're playing any kind of sane character, would be an easy choice anyway. But that's up to role-playing, so perhaps it's decent, but I just felt it was a bit cliche towards the end, especially the very final ending. There are numerous ways to actually finish the game. You can pretty much just straight up leave via an escape pod, like near the start of the game. It even prompts you and gives you a side quest to basically just leave. Or you can actually go through the game, which I'm presuming most people do, because that ending is almost like a failed ending if you choose that option, but it's there, and there are a lot of different choice elements in the story, and the side quests, like I mentioned earlier, play into that depending on who you save, depends on what happens in the story, or you can actually just kill anyone or anything that you find and ignore all of it and finish the game the way that you want. I'm not going to talk about the different endings because it's a bit of a spoiler, but there are tiers and layers of endings, and your choices all matter throughout the game, like the Typhon abilities that you can get help exploration and combat, but they also play a role in the story. If you install too many, the game will acknowledge this, and the artificial intelligence January that leads you through the game will note that you seem less human, and when he does scans of the Typhon, he says that you are the same signal as the Typhon, and come the end of the game, certain obstacles are presented in front of you if you've installed too many Typhon mods. So there's that element that plays into the story. I'm trying to be vague because I want to avoid spoilers, but the more Typhon mods you install through the game, the more the game punishes you in gameplay, combat elements, exploration, as well as story elements. For a game with such variety, so many optional routes, and so many gameplay choices, it's kind of strange that the side quests are mostly boiled down to go here, get this thing, come back, fetch quests. There are really only a few side quests in the game that actually matter, and they all play into the story, which is good because it gives gravity to your actions, and you can, instead of doing the side quests, you can straight up just kill the people, and it will affect how the story plays out and the ending that you get. And it gives you choice, which is good because this whole game is built around choice, like gameplay choice, story choice. Everything that you do will affect the game, and the game will, like with the Typhon mods, it will change depending on the way that you're playing. Now, the side quests were kind of weak, other than the fact that they affected the story. But there was one side quest that I got kind of invested in, but the rest, they just seemed very fetch questy. They are optional like everything in the game, but if you don't do them, it usually counts as a negative action almost, which is strange, but in a way kind of good because it depicts you as this sociopath who doesn't want to help the people in need. The level design in Prey feels like the perfect combination of Dishonored and Bioshock. The levels are really well designed, they're compact at times, whilst sprawling at others, similar to Dishonored. But they're also really dense and filled with alternate routes, like Bioshock and Dishonored. There's so many alternate ways to do a level, there's so many different stealth passages, more than or not there's multiple in the same location. This is probably the strongest asset of Prey. It lets you move around the world the way that you want. This is complemented by the weapons like the glue gun that let you traverse the walls, as well as neuromods that let you open up multiple possibilities to solve environmental puzzles. For example, the locked door, the enemy of every protagonist in FPS games. There are many in Prey, and there are also many ways to get through them or around them. You can hack your way through, you can find an alternative route over the top of the wall, you can smash through a window, you can force your way through the door with just strength given to you by neuromods. In some cases you can literally blast your way through doorways with recycler grenades. The point is that Prey uses environmental puzzles within the levels to prompt player choice within the character, which is a major theme throughout the entire game, and everything, especially exploration, plays into this player choice. Because this is an Arcane Studios game, and from what I saw from the trailers, I went into it thinking that I was going to be playing like a sci-fi Dishonored-esque game, but the levels and the way that they're personified within the game are a lot more Bioshock, and in fact a lot of the game is very Bioshock, from the retro sci-fi isolated setting, to the combat, to the looting, audio logs, environmental hazards, even a silent protagonist with sort of back of steel who lunges an arsenal of weapons and syringes around. It's all very, very Bioshock. And the way that it personifies itself with audio logs and whatnot is very Bioshock. And it tells these stories within the game, not necessarily with words, but sometimes just situations that you can find. You can find like dead people clutching certain things in certain positions in their room in a very similar way that Bioshock does. And I think it's a really neat way of telling stories within the world. Level design, like I said before, is incredibly dense. There's a hell of a lot of nooks and crannies that are packed into each level. For someone like me, it almost felt excessive because I felt obliged to search every part of the level to try to collect everything within the level, because there's so many objects that you can pick up, from weapons to neuromods and whatnot. As sort of a completionist, I felt the need to do that, and it got a bit boring after 10 hours. That's a note for the players. If you do intend to search everything, maybe don't worry so much about it. Maybe just sometimes pass through the levels and don't feel the need to grab everything, because after a while it does just feel like a collection simulator, because the levels are so dense, they fit so much stuff into the levels. Prey has this really interesting part of the environment, like I was saying before about it telling stories to the environment with audio logs. It does a similar thing through emails. There's a mountain of emails that you can go through and snoop through people's personal business. It's very interesting, and it's another thing that it does to personify its environment. This seems like a point about combat and not so much exploration, but it also affects exploration, so I'm going to mention it now. I'm not sure what the respawn rates for enemies are, but I'm fairly sure that enemies will respawn after a certain amount of time when you're inside the level. They definitely will once you leave the level because of story purposes and come back, and the level will be repopulated with more enemies, which is fun because then it sort of scales the difficulty up as you progress through the story, so you can't go to the end of the game and save all the side quests for like the very last mission and then go back and do it all, because the entire levels will all be now leveled to you basically, and there's a sense of urgency in that, and it's good. I feel that's good. But when you're traversing the levels, I often found that mimics and other Typhon would respawn at rates that I wasn't quite sure of, and that just seems like a strange decision to have them respawn so often when there's such a big emphasis on exploration. I feel like the game tries to balance exploration, combat, and stealth equally, but the rate that things respawn, or at least the amount of Typhon that are in the game, it messes with the difficulty of combat, and it kind of diminishes the limited resources that you get, and almost punishes you for exploring too much, which feels like a strange decision, but perhaps it is to give you more choice, or it's telling you exploring is all and good, but if you do it too much, it will sort of send more Typhon your way in a similar way that it does the neuromods. But that is somewhat speculation because I have no idea of the respawn rates, but at times it felt like things were respawning at a much quicker rate when I was just trying to get loot for more ammo. Now before I move on to movement and combat, I want to speak about the fact that exploration is really woven into the combat, in that certain weapons that you get are actually double as an explorative tool. Like the glue cannons are almost the most useful when trying to get up walls, and the Nerf crossbow thing, you can shoot through windows, and it's completely useless for an enemy unless you're trying to get their attention or something. It's really nice to see this like thing that's represented as a weapon but is purely for shooting at monitors and pressing buttons to get through doors. It's a really nice, refreshing puzzle motif almost. Exploration and combat are also interwoven in the way that mimics act. Mimics turn into objects and they will attack you when you get close enough or pick them up. And it's a really cool, I think it's one of the best enemy types in the game. It's obviously a jump scare device at some parts, but it can also be quite tense when you see them scatter into a level and turn into objects, and it adds this dimension of tension when you're searching things, and it makes you be careful. I'm going to start by describing the enemies of prey, the main enemies, the Typhon. They are sort of a black mass of alien, sort of your classic misanthropic aliens that just sort of seem to hate humans for whatever reason and want to conquer, divide, eat, devour. It's not really gone into too much, but they're very mechanically interesting. You've got the mimics which turn into objects, you've got the greater mimics which turn into larger objects and are generally just harder to kill. There's multiple different types of phantoms which are just walking bipedal enemies that will usually be some kind of elemental. Like you'll get, I'm not sure what the name is, but it's lightning and fire, and just normal phantoms that will have effects on the environment as well. Like the fire ones will light any oil that they walk through, and also the lightning phantoms will electrocute metal flooring if they're walking over it, which makes the exploration a bit more diverse as well. You also have the Nightmare, which will hunt you down if you use too many neuromods. Later in the game, it gives you a choice to actually summon this, and you can use it against enemies. And there are so many others. There's a Poltergeist that is an invisible phantom that you don't really see until it's attacking you. Otherwise, it's invisible. I won't go into too many others for the sake of spoilers, but they're all kind of mechanically very interesting. But unfortunately, they're all really visually boring. That can be forgiven for the Poltergeist and the mimics because they're basically these things that are invisible and turn into objects, which are really cool. But the phantoms, the Nightmare, all the other enemies in the game are literally just black masses, and it's such a small and feels like kind of a petty argument, but honestly, who wants to fight a bunch of black boogers when you could fight some cool looking aliens? But that's kind of petty. That's just a little bit of a shot at the enemy design. So you fight the Typhon with a strange array of weaponry. You got your traditional FPS weapons like your pistol, your wrench, your shotgun, and you got some stranger ones like your glue cannon, your Q-beam, and your Nerf crossbow. The glue cannon is particularly interesting because you use it to freeze enemies and then you can shotgun them and whatnot. adds like a strange dimension of combat that you don't traditionally see. And then you've got your Nerf crossbow, which I actually found useful for. There are small explosive enemies that, when touched, they explode and cause like a chain reaction of explosions, because they usually attack in packs. And I found that the Nerf crossbow was a really good way of attacking these, so I didn't have to actually waste my pistol ammunition. I could just shoot them and they'd get attracted to the Nerf crossbow and explode on it. And I thought that was a really cool, non-traditional weapon. And in the Bioshock Dishonored style, you've got ability weaponry. This manifests as neuromods, or Typhon neuromods to be specific, because they're the alien powers that you actually gain from the different enemy types. So you will actually be able to attack the Typhon with their own abilities, like creating small electrical charges in midair that will attack people around it, or explosives in the midair, or you can jump forward. That's more of a passive one, and it will create a decoy that enemies will attack for a few seconds. Or the Psyshock, which is like a attack that deals damage to Typhon but also disables their abilities. They're all catered to different play styles. They'll give you a choice of how you want to play. And these Typhon neuromods are a very interesting part of the combat, because the game does punish you for using too many. If you install too many, the Nightmare will come after you, and it's a bit of a pain in the ass boss. I mean, if you install enough neuromods, it becomes redundant, because it becomes easy enough to kill anyway, because the Psyshock and the Dash ability are just so overpowered that you can pretty much blaze through almost anything in the game with them. But there's still that choice there, is the main point. So unfortunately the difficulty curve does plateau fairly early if you install a shitload of neuromods. The story also kind of pushes you away from them as well, with like negative connotations towards installing too many. I mean, if you don't care about the story, that's not a big deal either though. Like in most games these days, there's a crafting system, and I actually quite like it, because it's not too in-depth. It's just sort of there as an optional thing, as with everything in this game, and you can mostly just feed anything that you find in the game into it, and it'll spit out its base components, and then you take that and you put it into another machine that allows you to craft things based on those base components that you have. And it's really nice because it rewards exploration and combat, and it gives you that choice. If you want to craft more things, you're going to have to explore or kill things to gain things, to get more things. It's a beautiful circle of life, really. It also plays into the neuromods, because you can actually make them. So there's a level of leveling within the crafting system, which is kind of cool. There's even recycler grenades that you can throw at enemies or objects and doors. Like I mentioned earlier, it's a feasible way of getting through a puzzle. It's literally just recycling the shit in your way, and that will give you crafting components, and it will solve the puzzle, or it could kill things, and they're quite powerful if you just decide to throw 40 of them at one big Typhon. Now obviously, with this being an arcane game, you can sneak around your enemies, or you can do other things like set up turrets to deal with them, or you can fight them yourself just normally with a shotgun, or you can glue cannon them and run away, or you can glue them and hit them with a wrench, or you can use your neuromods, or there's so many options. Just the game gives you so much choice, especially in combat. There's just so many ways to do everything, and this kind of does get a bit tedious, because towards the end you do feel like there's not really enough time, or you're just too overpowered to do much. And I think it's honestly a good thing that the game has so much player choice, because it's a really nice thing. It's kind of refreshing when most games these days just kind of play with the idea of player choice, but don't really give the player like so many different ways to do everything. But I think it honestly just comes down to the fact that you're kind of too overpowered towards the end, and the enemies stop leveling with you and just become a bit easy towards the end of the game, and you can mostly just run past them inconsequently. Now the movement I quite like, because it's very Dishonored, but somehow it feels a bit more sluggish or less accurate or direct. It just doesn't feel quite as precise as Dishonored 2's movement, which isn't that bad, because it's honestly still really good. There's sliding, vaulting, jumping, you can grab ledges, and that all works well. Feels very Dishonored, which I quite like, because it's probably one of my favourite movement systems in any game. It feels very precise, but this it does feel a bit more sluggish, and that's hard to describe without playing it. But there's also 0G, which is like entire levels where you can move up the entire middle of the ship, accurately named the guts, or move around the outside of the ship. And while that's fun and it mixes up the levels, it can be a huge pain in the ass, because in combat it's awful, and it's really just disorienting, and it's a fast way to travel but like if you hit something whilst boosting too fast towards it, you'll get dealt a lot of damage, which is kind of a pain in the ass. But mostly just the fact that you don't understand the way that you're oriented and you're sort of just floating around attacking enemies. So the 0G moments were kind of fun for me, but only early on. After like an hour or so, I kind of got bored of the 0G moments and levels and tried to avoid them entirely. Now before I do a conclusion, just a quick thought on the bugs and optimization of the game. Coming off the back of Dishonored 2 being pretty unoptimized at launch, I was really refreshed with this game because it seemed really optimized, even though I didn't get it at launch, and by the time I started playing it, it already had a few patches drilled into it. I'm fairly sure it started off being a pretty well optimized game and running pretty good on most mid-tier systems. The only real bugs that I found was that there was one level where I got a bunch of frame drops, but once I restarted, it worked fine, and there was some weird audio glitches when I moved in and out of rooms, like the audio in a room would completely cut out rather than getting quieter as I moved out of the room, and it was definitely a bug. It wasn't just a weird perception thing. In conclusion, if you're a fan of games like Dishonored and System Shock, then I think you would really enjoy Prey, and I definitely recommend it for you. It's pretty similar to games like Dishonored and System Shock because of its focus on gameplay choice. Everything about the game attempts to give you the ability to play the way you want, which feeds into replayability. There are constraints. Most of the puzzles are pretty simple and they're boiled down to getting through a door, and once you've discovered all the ways to do this, it can become pretty boring quickly. The game could benefit from more variety in this regard, and combat and exploration, however, work well, and there is a lot of variety there. Despite the fact that most of the enemies are pretty visually boring and look more like giant balls of snot than intimidating aliens. And also, once new stronger enemies stop being introduced about 2/3 through the game, the combat becomes very easy in most playstyles. The game's story also starts strong but loses momentum quickly with only a few brief moments of interest, although this is outshined somewhat by the sheer focus on gameplay and allowing the different playstyles. Prey is a game of choices, not just dialogue and combat, but exploration and story. If you enjoy the Dishonored games for their differing playstyles and choice-based gameplay, then I think you would definitely enjoy this game. I recommend it. That being said, if you're looking for a game with a lot more replayability, I would suggest Dishonored 2 over Prey, simply because the story and combat lose their momentum come the end of the game, and some of the choices don't feel like they matter nearly as much as they do in something like Dishonored. Anyway, that's all. Thanks for watching.